So imagine writing a check for $1 billion
All right.
to solve this massive, completely heartbreaking crisis. But then you step outside your multi-million-dollar estate and you find that exact same crisis sleeping literally on your welcome mat. Welcome to today's deep dive.
We have a really fascinating one for you today.
We do. We are taking a look at a highly provocative analytical essay titled Rich Man and Lazarus.
Yeah, it takes a 2,000-year-old biblical text, specifically the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16.
Right, and it uses that ancient text as a lens to critique the modern homelessness crisis unfolding on the U.S. West Coast.
It's quite a leap, but it's incredibly thought-provoking.
It really is. But before we dive into the deep end, let's just set the parameters for our conversation. The source material we're looking at contains some deeply political charged arguments.
Oh, definitely. It gets into civic duty, the effectiveness of government bureaucracy, and modern welfare policies.
Exactly. So our goal here is not to endorse the author's political views or, advocate for any specific policy. We are simply impartially unpacking the architecture of this argument.
Just trying to understand what it claims about human nature and moral responsibility.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because mapping a first-century parable onto ultra-modern tech-driven cities sounds wild on paper.
It is a striking rhetorical maneuver, taking a foundational religious text and dropping it directly onto the modern pavement of Los Angeles, San Francisco, or Seattle.
It kind of forces a completely different perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, on policies we usually only discuss in terms of urban planning or like municipal budgets.
But the author argues the parallels are essentially one-to-one. So before we get into the modern multi-million-dollar estates and the unhoused, lay the groundwork for us. What are the actual mechanics of the original parable?
Well, the story sets up this brutal, almost cinematic contrast. We are introduced to a rich man who is clothed in purple and fine linen, and he feasts sumptuously every single day. Now, in the context of the ancient Mediterranean, purple dye was extracted, drop by drop from sea snails.
Wait, really? Sea snails?
Yeah, it was astonishingly expensive. So wearing purple wasn't just a sign of comfort. It was a blaring siren of absolute top-tier wealth and untouchable status.
Wow, so it's the first century equivalent of stepping out of a private jet wearing bespoke haute couture.
Precisely. He is broadcasting his total insulation from the struggles of everyday survival.
Okay, so that's the rich man.
Right. And contrast that staggering opulence with the second figure, Lazarus. He is a destitute man, covered in sores, and he is physically laid at the gate of the rich man's estate.
Just lying right outside.
Exactly. And the text notes that Lazarus didn't even ask for a seat at the table. He simply desired to be fed with the crumbs that fell from it.
That is just wow.
To emphasize the total degradation, the story adds that feral street dogs would actually come and lick his wounds.
It's an incredibly visceral image. You have unimaginable wealth secured behind a gate, and then this raw, agonizing destitution lying immediately outside of it.
And the central premise of the essay we're looking at is that this ancient metaphor has ceased to be a metaphor.
Right.
The author argues it is now the literal geographic reality of the American West Coast.
Because you look at the hyper-concentration of wealth in tech and entertainment hubs.
Yes, in these specific urban centers, you have unprecedented historic prosperity existing literally inches away from sprawling encampments of the unhoused.
The physical distance between extreme wealth and extreme poverty has completely vanished.
The modern Lazarus is quite literally lying at the gates of modern estates.
What I found deeply compelling in the source material, though, is how the author defines the actual wrongdoing here. Because the essay is very clear that the rich man's sin wasn't an act of overt, cartoonish villainy.
Yeah, the cruelty is in the passivity. The essay emphasizes that the rich man didn't kick Lazarus.
He didn't, order his private guards to chase the beggar away.
Or have him arrested, right? The sin was one of profound omission and systemic blindness.
He just walked past him.
He simply stepped over Lazarus every single day on his way in and out of his estate. He saw the suffering, but he learned how to look right through it.
Until the suffering simply became part of the landscape.
Exactly.
And that systemic blindness feels incredibly recognizable to anyone living today. Think about the morning commute.
Right, you walk past a person sleeping on the concrete.
And maybe you just stare a little harder at your smartphone to avoid eye contact. We build these psychological calluses to navigate past suffering without having to emotionally engage with it.
We absolutely do.
But if the blindness is exactly the same today as it was in the parable, it begs a massive question. How do we justify it?
What's our modern excuse?
Yeah, how does a society that prides itself on compassion justify stepping over the modern Lazarus?
Well, that brings us to the core thesis of the essay. The author identifies our modern justification as a concept called delegated morality.
Delegated morality.
Okay. In contemporary West Coast society, affluent citizens mask their systemic blindness through civic compliance. They use the apparatus of the state to insulate their conscience.
I want to break down how that mechanism actually works in practice for you. Civic compliance obviously means paying state taxes, voting for housing initiatives, funding massive municipal bonds.
Right. The thought process is, I voted for the billion-dollar proposition.
I pay an incredibly high state income tax rate, therefore I have done my part. The government is handling the person on the sidewalk.
What's fascinating here is the psychological comfort of that delegated virtue. The author is suggesting that outsourcing charity to a massive bureaucracy strips the act of its personal moral weight.
It just becomes paperwork.
Exactly. We operate under the assumption that funding the state absolves us of the messy, uncomfortable duty of direct human care. We essentially pay the state to be our moral proxy.
I want to push back on this conceptually just to really test the bounds of the author's logic.
Yeah.
So the argument is that writing a massive check to the state tax board doesn't substitute for looking someone in the eye and helping them directly.
Right.
It's a bit like, imagine realizing you've been a terrible spouse, and instead of having a vulnerable, difficult conversation with your partner, you hire an elite, expensive PR firm to issue a formal apology on your behalf.
That is a perfect analogy.
You spent a fortune, you technically executed the task of apologizing, but you completely outsourced the soul of the act. The human connection is entirely absent.
That perfectly captures the absurdity the author is pointing out. The PR firm handles the logistics of the apology, but it lacks the intimacy required for genuine repair.
Right.
The essay actually makes a historical parallel to drive this exact point home. It notes that in the afterlife, the rich man couldn't suddenly plead to Abraham that he had paid his civic dues.
Oh, interesting.
He couldn't argue that he contributed heavily to the Roman grain dole, which was the massive welfare system of the Roman Empire that distributed subsidized food.
Because the Roman grain dole, much like a modern municipal bond, is just an administrative mechanism. It doesn't require a change of heart.
Exactly the point. The indictment in the parable was intensely personal because the opportunity to act was sitting at his own personal gate.
So morality, according to this essay, is inherently unoutsourceable.
You cannot hire a bureaucracy to love your neighbor for you.
Okay, so if we accept the author's philosophical premise that delegating morality to the state is a spiritual failure for the individual that naturally leads to the practical side of the equation.
Right. How is the proxy performing?
Exactly. If we are hiring the government to be our moral proxy, how does the essay evaluate the state as an intermediary?
According to the source material, the state fails catastrophically as an intermediary, both physically on the streets and financially.
Okay.
The author provides a very specific structural critique, claiming that despite billions of dollars in taxpayer revenue being allocated annually, the crisis only deepens.
Walk me through the mechanics of that failure, according to the text, because it's one thing to say a system is broken, but how does the essay argue that a billion-dollar bond effectively evaporates before it ever reaches the street?
Well, the essay points to the existence of what it calls the nonprofit industrial complex.
Okay.
The claim is that when a billion-dollar bond is passed, that money doesn't go straight to housing or mental health care. First, it filters through the municipal bureaucracy.
Right.
Then it gets awarded in grants to a massive network of non-governmental organizations and nonprofits.
And the argument is that this network swallows the resources.
The author claims the funds evaporate into administrative bloat. The money goes toward endless feasibility studies, legal compliance, executive salaries, and consulting fees.
So by the time the bureaucratic machine has taken its share, just to sustain its own existence, there are only pennies left for the actual person suffering on the sidewalk.
Precisely. Furthermore, the essay critiques policies framed as compassionate, such as sanctuary cities, arguing they act as a pretext to draw in marginalized populations from other areas.
Wait, what would be the incentive for a municipality to intentionally draw in a larger marginalized population? I mean, that seems completely counterintuitive to solving the problem.
The text argues that expanding the dependent class is actually a mechanism used to justify even larger municipal budgets and expanded bureaucratic authority for the following year.
Oh, wow.
If the crisis is solved, the industry built around managing the crisis loses its funding. Therefore, the system is incentivized to manage the problem rather than solve it.
Here's where it gets really interesting and pretty controversial. The author is taking a very hard swing at the architecture of civic policy here.
Definitely.
But looking at the core logic of the essay, is the author arguing that the government inherently shouldn't be involved in helping the poor? Or is the point simply that a bureaucratic system, no matter how well funded, is fundamentally incapable of replacing individual human empathy?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it leans entirely toward the latter.
Okay.
The critique isn't necessarily a blanket condemnation of civic organization. Rather, it attacks the illusion that civic organization can replace personal virtue.
So relying on the state to do our moral heavy lifting allows individuals to retreat into comfort.
Exactly. The bureaucracy provides a psychological shield. We don't have to look the poor in the eye or engage with their trauma because we believe an agency has been fully funded to bridge that gap on our behalf.
But the agency fails to bridge the gap, which means the physical separation remains.
Yes.
So if the machine fails on the ground, what happens to the person who relied on that machine to do their moral work?
Well, the essay transitions from the failure of the political systems straight into the ultimate eternal consequences for the individual.
Following the narrative arc of the parable.
Right, which ends in a drastic, permanent inversion of reality. The climax of the story in Luke 16 is that both men die.
And upon death, the earthly hierarchy is entirely flipped.
Lazarus, the poor man who is covered in sores, is carried away to Abraham's side and is finally comforted. The rich man, however, finds himself buried and in the torments of Hades.
And in that state of torment, the rich man finally acknowledges Lazarus.
He does.
He looks up, sees him with Abraham, and asks for help.
He calls out to Abraham in agony, begging him to have mercy. And his specific request is fascinating.
What does he ask?
He asks Abraham to send Lazarus to just dip the tip of his finger in water to cool his tongue.
Wow.
The man who spent his life refusing to offer even a leftover crumb from his banquet table is now begging for a single drop of water from the very man he ignored.
It's a staggering reversal of power. But Abraham denies the request,
He does.
and he doesn't just deny it out of vindictiveness or spite. He outlines a structural reality about the afterlife.
Yes, Abraham reminds the rich man of the disparity in their earthly lives, that he received good things while Lazarus received terrible things.
Right.
But then Abraham points out a terrifying geographical reality of the afterlife. He says, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed.
It's a great chasm.
This chasm is absolute. It prevents anyone from crossing over from either side, even if they wanted to.
So what does this all mean for the modern West Coast context? Because the essay's interpretation of that chasm is chilling.
It really is.
It makes me think immediately of the literal physical gates we see today in affluent neighborhoods. You know, the high walls in Bel Air, the private security patrols in Pacific Heights.
The physical barriers society meticulously builds to protect its wealth from the reality of the streets.
Exactly.
Well, the author argues that the chasm in the afterlife is simply the eternal spiritual manifestation of the physical and emotional divide the rich man spent his whole life building.
Oh.
By ignoring the beggar at his door, by meticulously constructing a life that avoided the discomfort of poverty, he forged an impassable void.
So the very walls society builds to protect its comfort and the psychological walls of delegating our morality to the government are constructing that spiritual chasm in real time.
Yes.
The essay is presenting the incredibly dark thought that the tools we use to insulate ourselves might actually be the exact things that trap us in the end.
It serves as a stark warning to those who have the resources to effect change. Those who choose to remain insulated behind their gates, relying on a broken political system to exercise virtue on their behalf, are jeopardizing their own spiritual well-being.
So the convenience of modern governance isn't just inefficient, it becomes a spiritual trap.
Exactly.
Now, when the rich man realizes he is entirely trapped by this chasm, he pivots. He realizes it's too late to save himself, so he tries to leverage the situation to save his family.
Right.
How does the author utilize this final exchange in the parable to wrap up the critique of the West Coast?
The rich man makes one final desperate plea. He begs Abraham to send Lazarus back from the dead to his father's house. He wants Lazarus to warn his 5 brothers so they don't end up in this place of torment.
His logic being that if a supernatural event occurs, if someone literally rises from the grave to warn them, surely that will be enough data to wake them up.
Which seems like a reasonable assumption, right? A ghost showing up in your living room to tell you to change your life would generally prompt a reevaluation of your priorities.
You would certainly think so.
But Abraham's response is biting. and incredibly revealing.
Yeah.
He tells the rich man, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them.
Okay.
The rich man pushes back, insisting, no, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent.
And what does Abraham say?
He delivers the final devastating line of the parable. If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead.
That is heavy. The implication is that if you are already choosing to ignore the fundamental moral laws of humanity that you know to be true, no amount of spectacular new information is going to change your heart.
Exactly.
How does the essay map that final warning onto the modern homelessness crisis?
The author's takeaway is a direct parallel to how cities attempt to manage the crisis today. The essay concludes that the West Coast does not need more data.
Right. It doesn't need another 5-year impact study.
It doesn't need more complex tax initiatives, and it doesn't need another bureaucratic committee to try and understand the human catastrophe unfolding on its sidewalks.
Because the author's point is that the moral standard is already known. The requirement to care for the vulnerable has always been known.
We don't need a ghost or a new task force to tell us that we shouldn't step over suffering people.
The essay argues that until individuals are willing to step past the intermediary of the state and reclaim personal, uncomfortable moral responsibility, this tragedy will just continue to loop endlessly.
Until citizens directly recognize and alleviate the suffering at their own physical gates, the crisis will persist, carrying with it the same severe consequences described in the parable.
As you navigate your own day after listening to this, it's a profound framework to apply to your own life. Obviously, the sheer scale of West Coast homelessness is massive and complex, but the core question this essay forces you to ask is deeply intimate.
It really is.
What are the systems you might be using to do your own moral heavy lifting? Where do you outsource your empathy to avoid difficult, messy human interactions?
And this raises a crucial question about the trajectory of our society. The author is deeply concerned with the state acting as a blunt, ineffective intermediary.
Right.
But as technology advances, we're building far more efficient intermediaries than municipal governments. We're designing systems specifically optimized to filter out discomfort.
That is a fascinating and, frankly, terrifying thread to pull on. If outsourcing our morality to the state strips us of our humanity and creates this great chasm, what happens when we introduce AI into the equation?
It's a huge shift.
Because right now, we are beginning to delegate even our basic empathy and communication to algorithms. We have AI writing our emails, curating our social feeds.
It's effectively deciding what realities we're even allowed to see.
Exactly. We are moving towards spatial computing and augmented reality, where software could theoretically just blur out the encampments on the street as you walk by.
That's a chilling thought.
If the rich man was condemned simply for stepping over Lazarus and ignoring him, will future generations face an even wider, more insurmountable chasm? Because our technology might become so efficient at hiding the Lazarus at our gate that we never even have to look away.
The algorithm just edits the suffering out of our reality entirely.
Right. If the machine ensures you never even have to see the suffering in the first place, can you still be held morally responsible for ignoring it?
The parable suggests the answer might be yes, because the choice to wear the blindfold is still a choice.
Something incredibly heavy to mull over as you encounter the gates in your own life today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been an absolute pleasure to unpack this complex, challenging essay with you.
Thank you for listening, and keep asking the hard questions.